What's up guys, I'm Rich from Spray Black Studios, and today it's time to give the Grimdark treatment to everybody's favourite bolter-wielding Twilight wannabes, the Blood Angels. So guys, to continue my series of Grimdark Marines, we now come to the turn of the Blood Angels. The Sons of Sanguinius are definitely one of my favourite chapters, or legions, depending on millennia, in the lore. And although I do love a good Twilight joke, they are one that I've been planning on adding to this series for quite some time now. Now if you found this video, you've probably already got a pretty good idea of what the Grimdark style entails. If that's not the case, then the Grimdark style of painting focuses on trying to encapsulate that grim and gritty look, and that image that people generally get when thinking about the Warhammer 40,000 universe. This style of painting generally uses particular products and techniques to try and get a more realistic looking miniature. The hallmarks of the Grimdark style are generally using darker and much more desaturated colours than you would normally get in something like the Games Workshop's heavy metal painting style. You also tend to find that they'll use a lot of weathering, and definitely a lot if it's me doing it. If you want more of an insight into the Grimdark painting style, then I do have some other videos on my channel which do go into a little bit more depth. I've done previous Space Marine chapters such as the Raven Guard, the White Scars and the Black Templars. So that's probably enough talking. Let's get to painting. I've based this guy using the Vallejo black surface primer, but if you don't have an airbrush, a spray of Citadel's Chaos Black will also do the job nicely. For the base coat, I'm going to again be lazy and use the airbrush, but this is far from essential. Using a normal brush is certainly possible for this, but the airbrush is easier and quicker, and as I mentioned, I'm lazy. I'll use the Vallejo Scarlet Red for my base coat here. It's a lovely dark red, which is just a little bit darker than Citadel's Corn Red, which you may know is one of my absolute favourite paints in their range. I'll try and get a pretty even coating with this, but I'm pretty happy for some of the black to still show through in some of those real shadowed areas. To throw a bit of variation into these tones, I'll grab out the Vallejo Bloody Red, and sticking with the airbrush, I'll apply this in more of a zenithal manner. This means that generally I'll be spraying this from almost directly above to give an impression of the light coming from directly above the miniature. This will leave some of that lovely dark red colour down in the shadowed and recessed areas. I will, however, also pick out a few small points of interest as well, such as the lower leg plates and the arms. Generally, some of the places where your eye will naturally be drawn to a little bit more. Now while highlighting's been done, I want to do a little bit of shading just to make that colour and that contrast pop a bit more, and for that we're going to use an oil wash. Oil paints are definitely a favourite of people who paint in the Grimdark style, and part of this is because of the level of control that they give you that you just can't get with acrylic paints. So today I'm going to make up a wash using some Winsor & Newton dioxazine blue and a little bit of ivory black. Having mixed these up with some white spirit, I'll apply this wash all over the miniature. Another real benefit that I've found of using oil washes as opposed to acrylic washes is that they do a great job of drawing into the recesses of the model, making them absolutely perfect for pin washing. Now whilst oil washes don't generally leave the tide marks like an acrylic wash will, we do want to remove it from the higher areas so that that highlight layer is going to shine through nicely again. To do this, you can dunk a cotton bud into some clean white spirit and then roll this over the areas of the model that I want to remove the wash from, focusing on areas like the shoulder pads, the top of the backpack and the top of his arms. Doing this will leave the wash down in those recesses to give a nice pin washing effect, and it will slightly darken some of those shadowed areas, but it will lift it off those highlights and that nice strong red colour will shine through. So now I'm pretty happy with the armour for the moment, so it's time to get to work on some of those details. For metallics such as the sword, the belt buckle and the ribbon in between those armour plates, we're going to use the awesome Vallejo Metal Colour Magnesium. This is a range of paints that I really cannot rave about enough. Designed for an airbrush, but they apply so smoothly with a brush that they really are the best metallics that I've used. To give these areas a little bit of shade in, I will return to that oil wash that we used earlier, and I'm going to carefully apply this to all of those areas. As it will act as a wash, you don't need to go back in and remove it again at this point. We're just going to let it sit in those recesses. Not all of the metallics will be silver though, and it probably isn't a Blood Angel until it's got a bit of bling. For the gold, I'm going to use something new in the Vallejo Premium Airbrush Colour Gold. Again designed for use through the airbrush, this paint is a bit thinner than you'll find in most ranges. Due to the fact that it is designed for an airbrush, you tend to find that the pigments aren't quite as thick and won't clump together as much as you'll find in something like the Citadel paint range. It is more of a pale, flatter looking gold, but for what I want with this guy, this is going to be perfect. I'll apply this to a few areas such as the aquila on his chest, the shoulder pads and the hilt of his sword. This will take a couple of thin coats to really get a perfect finish, but it's definitely best to have a bit of patience when working with metallics like this. To throw a little bit more colour into that gold, I will be using a thin down Reikland Flesh Wash just to draw down into those recesses. As you can see, I've applied this a little bit too heavy initially, but until it dries it's fairly easy to manipulate this around a bit with the brush just to get it to sit where you want it. For his bolt pistol, I don't want to do anything fancy, so having given it a simple base coat of Abaddon Black, I'll then dry brush some highlights on it using Dawnstone dry paint. A lot of these highlights will get somewhat lost with the future weathering steps, so you don't really need to spend too long on this step. Now there are a few little details to do on this model, such as the grenades, the leather packs and the purity seals, but I'm not going to show you them all as I don't want this to be a 30-minute long video. But for all those areas such as the purity seals and the scroll work, a couple of thin coats of Rakarth flesh will give us our base coat and then allow the weathering materials to do their work. I am going to show you how I painted his head though. As you may have noticed, I am painting this up in a sub-assembly, as this does make life considerably easier for getting to areas that would normally be very hard to reach. Using Bugmans Glow for the base of the skin tone, I'll apply this slowly and carefully, making sure I've thinned it down appropriately. When painting skin tones, you want to get as smooth a finish as you can, so taking your time to thin down your paints properly and apply them gradually will really help to prevent any pigment clumping or any brush marks. Mixing in some Cadian Fleshtone, I'll then pick out all those raised areas such as his nose, his forehead and his cheeks, making sure to leave some of that Bugman's Glow down in the recesses. As we're working with quite thin paints here, it is a bit easier to get a nice blend here too. Returning with just pure Cadian Fleshtone, I'll then pick out those very top highlights. Hitting those real raised areas of his cheekbones, the top of his forehead and the tip of his nose, this will give that skin tone a little bit more definition and just pop that contrast a little bit more. With the skin tone in place, it's time to get to work on his hair. Now I always feel that it's fitting for a Blood Angel to have nice flowing blonde hair just like Sanguinius. I've previously done a video on how to paint more realistic blonde hair, and I'm going to use that same technique today. Starting with a base coat of Zandri dust, this will give us that nice golden colour to start with. Over the black, this will take at least a couple of thin coats, but remember, patience is a virtue. Now the Zandri dust is very yellow and we do need to desaturate it a little. Using Rakarth flesh, I can pick out the sculpted detail on the hair, leaving that Zandri dust down in the recesses and in his roots. This not only brightens it, but it does add quite a nice desaturated highlight. With a wash of thinned down Reikland flesh shade, I'll darken down those recesses a little bit more, and then with some thinned down Agrax earth shade, I'll again remove just a little bit of that brightness and just make it a bit more dull. To stop it from looking completely flat though, out comes the Rakarth flesh again, and very carefully I will pick out the real top of the raised areas. This will give me a nice amount of contrast and depth, and it looks more realistic than the bright yellow hair that you often see. Now all the details are done, it's time to get to work on all that battle damage and weathering that's really going to pull this model together. Starting off with a mix of the Vallejo Scarlet Red that I used for all those armour plates earlier, and a little bit of Vallejo Black. I pick out all of those raised areas of battle damage that I made on the armour plating. I'll also add in a few scratches here and there too. Using a piece of foam, I'll also use this mix just to add a little bit more wear and tear. Mainly looking at the lower legs and the shoulder pads. For this, I'm going to need to make sure that I don't overload the foam too much and use very gentle dabbing motions. To add a small highlight and to really make those bits of damage look like peeling paint, I'm going to grab out some Mephiston Red and add a very thin line to the underside of all those scratches. Now we're all set for the weathering and it's time for everybody's favourite, Streaking Grime. Now I'm not going to be using the standard Streaking Grime for this model. Instead, I'm going to be using the Streaking Grime Panzer Grey. Rather than being the murky green colour of the standard Streaking Grime, it's a lovely dark reddish brown colour which will work lovely in the recesses of this red armour and with those metallics too. This can be applied using an airbrush, but for our purposes today, I'm going to grab an old battered synthetic brush and apply the Streaking Grime pretty liberally all over the model. Now just like the oil wash, the joy of an enamel paint like this is that with some white spirit you can manipulate it and remove it from where you don't want it to be. Just like with the oil wash earlier, I'm going to use a cotton bud dipped in white spirit to gently go around the model, removing the Streaking Grime from where I don't want it to be. This is probably one of the more satisfying moments when painting in the Grimdark style. A good Streaking Grime reveal is almost therapeutic. Now we're going to have to leave this guy a little while for all that white spirit to evaporate off, and then we're going to come back to him. So having left him for a while, you can now see that the Streaking Grime has been mostly left in the recesses, and the nice strong red colour of that armour has now come through. This grime does dull down and desaturate some of those colours, but it also gives that armour a nice dirty and worn look. I do however find that often the addition of Streaking Grime can mean that we lose some of our contrast. When the grime sits in those real deepest of recesses, it does tend to lighten them slightly, and it also dulls down the highlights somewhat. To counter this, I'll go back to the same black oil wash that we used earlier, and using a small brush this time, I'm going to apply this as a pin wash to all of those recesses. This will darken these down a little bit and give us just that little bit more definition. Now the bulk of this model has been completed, but I want to make sure that that sword looks a little bit more eye-catching and a little bit less flat. To do this, I'm going to use a couple of techniques that I showed in my previous Grimdark using Only Games Workshop products video, and this will start with some heavily thinned down riser rust applied as a glaze on the inner areas of the blade. I'll leave the cutting edge clean as I still want that to be nice and silver, but I'll gradually build up this glaze until we have a nice rusty effect going on. I'll then pick up the Nihilak oxide and do exactly the same with this. I will however go a little bit more sparingly on this step, I only want a very slight effect here. So having added a couple of the effects, I want to make the sword look a little bit more battered and chipped. To do this, I'm going to apply some Runelord brass using a piece of foam, much like I did with the chipping on the armour earlier. Again, using a very light dabbing motion, I'll build up a few chips and scrapes. To really sell the effect, I'll keep that foam handy and do exactly the same using Vallejo's metal colour chrome. This will add a very bright silver onto the blade to give the impression of very recent damage. So now I'm pretty happy with all the painting steps, and it's time for the finishing touches. Using super glue, I'll attach the head to the body, and then I'll pop him onto this ruined city base that I made earlier. Now I need to make him look like he belongs on this base, so out come the Vallejo weathering pigments. As this is a predominantly grey base, I'll start with the Vallejo dark slate grey pigment. I'd always say apply these with a clean and dry brush, but when I did this, the brush had some residual moisture in it and I didn't notice until it was too late. The base doesn't just have grey and black tones on it though, so I'll use some brown iron oxide just to throw in a little bit more visual interest. As a final touch, just to darken it down a little, I'll use a tiny light dusting of carbon black, and then I'll fix this in place again using a little bit of white spirit. Now I'm pretty happy with that, but it feels like there is something missing. What more could a blood angel possibly need? Oh yeah, blood. For the blood effect, I'm going to use a mix of Typhus Corrosion and Blood for the Blood God. This will give a nice dark and dirty blood effect. I'll start off by applying this down the cutting edge of the blade using a small brush, and then using very light and quick brush strokes, I'll drag it across the blade away from the initial point of contact, just to give the impression of a little bit of blood splatter. To sell the effect just a little bit more, I'm going to add some more at that initial point of contact, and then we really are done. And there you have it, one Grimdark Blood Angel. Now, as I've mentioned earlier, the Grimdark style generally favours nice, dark, desaturated colour palettes. And that is actually something that is really quite hard to achieve when you're painting something that is so traditionally bright and vibrant, such as the armour on something like this Blood Angel. Now, just caking the model in streaking grime can go a long way to achieving this look, but for me personally, actually, it's not all about the model looking dirty for the sake of being dirty. And to achieve this sort of look, actually a lot of thought needs to go into the other colour choices that you make on the model. Using the quite pale and desaturated Vallejo airbrush gold, as opposed to something like GW's Retributor gold, which is a very bright yellowy gold, can actually make a huge difference to the overall look of the miniature. And to be honest, this is one of the reasons why I actually don't rate the Games Workshop metallics all that well. They are, much like their painting style, generally very bright and quite often very, very saturated. Now, I will admit that this Blood Angel isn't quite as grim as he maybe could be, but as I've mentioned earlier, for me it's not all about making something look dirty and drab for the sake of it, and actually I'm pushing for a little bit of realism, or at least as real as we can get when talking about fictional 8-foot tall superhumans. There is an expectation that when painting Blood Angels, you do still want to keep some of that noble and regal look. I still wanted to show that nice strong red armour and those gold accents, just without all that saturation and vibrancy that Games Workshop paint jobs tend to show. If you want to give this method a try but you don't have some of the products that I've used in this video, then I have put my affiliate link for the awesome guys over at Firestorm Games down in the description below. They keep a great stock of things like the AK Interactive products, which can be a little bit difficult to get hold of, and I've always found that they've been super quick with delivery. Brilliant if, like me, you're pretty impatient. By purchasing through this link, you'll also help to support the channel a little bit, as they will provide me with a little bit of a kickback, which gives me more money to spend on fun things for the channel. So guys, if you've enjoyed this video, then please let me know by hitting that like button down below, and whilst you're down there, maybe throw a cheeky little comment in the box just to let me know what you thought of this paint scheme. There's also a lovely big red subscribe button down below to hit if you haven't already. Doing so will mean that you won't miss out on my future Grimdark goodness. And remember guys, if all else fails, spray it black and start again.